If you look hard enough, maybe around the attic or basement, you might find some hidden treasure.
Yeah, it could be right inside your home. And Jeff Maliski from Mid-Century Modern Rescue is here in the studio to tell us about some fascinating finds that he has snatched up from some of his furniture rescues. And good morning, Jeff. Come on in here.
Morning.
And tell us about, I mean, you have a great job, because what I love is that you never know what you're really going to find, right?
Right.
Yeah.
When I leave the house every morning, I don't leave the house typically looking for something, but I always seem to find it. Almost every day it seems like I'm finding interesting pieces. And part of that process is when I find these pieces, sometimes I'll find something interesting, maybe inside of the piece, or maybe interesting backstory to where this piece lived its entire life. And that's what I thought I'd bring today with me, a couple of those examples of things that I found over the last couple of years.
And kind of one thing leads to another to another.
Of course.
Yeah, and that's what you have here today. So tell us about the most interesting thing.
Okay, so the first thing, there's two things. The first thing is an old dresser I found, as you typically do behind the drawers of an old dresser, postcards, paper, napkins, things like that. I found a couple old letters that were, one was handwritten, one was typed, had no idea what they were, and as I read them, it turns out that these letters were written by a gentleman that was in the U.S. Army during World War II.
Oh, wow.
And the letters went into great detail to tell his family what he had been doing the last 2 years, because he wasn't allowed to discuss with anybody the project he was working on.
Yeah.
Turns out the project he was working on, he was one of the scientists that helped develop the atomic bomb.
No kidding.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's just an incredible
Your
story.
jaw just drops from something like that, right?
Believe it.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. And the letter that he type wrote to his brother talked about some of the famous minds he worked with on a project. People like Einstein and Fermi and some Compton, some of the great scientific minds of all time. So he was stationed in Chicago, lived at the Waldorf Hotel for 2 years in civilian clothes, worked every day at the University of Chicago to help build the atomic bomb.
I mean, how incredible is it that a random find like this, not only, it's interesting, but I mean, it's also documenting history.
Oh, yeah. And I reached out. I was able to track down the family members that were still alive. He grew up in the Portland, Oregon area. The family was aware of the letters. Some of them remembered it, but I was able to let them know I had them, send them back to them so they could keep them. So I made copies of what I had, and they were very, very appreciative. Probably the most interesting thing of the family members I talked to, the one common trait they talked about, Manuel Holtzman was his name, was how intelligent he was.
Yeah.
Well,
I said, well, of course. He helped develop the atomic bomb.
And you've got another find here that I am just really fascinated by because it has a Cincinnati connection, and it is, as you said, Pete, history.
Right. So the second one is some furniture that I had purchased to restore and resell from a family here in Cincinnati. And as it turns out, as I'm looking through the apartment, I see a lot of portraits and newspaper articles. And I asked them, who is this gentleman? And they said, well, that's our grandfather. Turns out their grandfather's name was Jimmy Winkfield. He was the last African-American to win the Kentucky Derby.
Wow.
He was a jockey. He won the Kentucky Derby in 1901, 1902, and over a span of his career, he won over 2,500 horse races.
And there's a Cincinnati Enquirer article about him there. We just showed that. But yeah, and then he was in Sports Illustrated, right?
Yeah, the family was able to share a lot of the documentation of who he was, what he did. They shared a book with me that was written on his life and times called Wink. That was his nickname. And then also an article we found in Sports Illustrated that was written about him in 1961, which would have been the 60th anniversary of his last Kentucky Derby win.
I know for sports fans anyway, I mean, that's pretty cool. What year is this, Sports Illustrated? They had like Gary Player on the cover.
Yeah, it was 1961.
Golfer. Wow.
1961, and the family...
They had a good year.
Yeah.
The family had a lot of documentation of his career, but they didn't have this particular issue.
Wow.
And since I deal with things from the mid-century time period, I said, you know what? I'll find it for you.
So you were able to give them something.
Yeah, and sure enough, I found a couple editions of this magazine. Terrific article about they already knew everything in the article, but it's just nice to have to put it in their archive.
Sure.
They have this documentation of the grandfather.
I know you find a lot of the stuff, you refurbish a lot of things. So what do people expect when they come into your shop?
They want to see things that are that might remind them of their past, that maybe they grew up with. They also want to see things that are in beautiful, terrific condition, and that's really what I take pride in. I restore these pieces back to what they would have looked like when they came out of the showroom.
And so if anybody has anything around their house right now, they think it could be worth something, what do they need to do to contact you?
Yeah, the easiest way to contact me is through my Instagram page, which is very simple. It's the name of my company, Mid-Century Modern Rescue. You can type that in. It'll pop right up on there, and just reach out that way.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a few things I might have.
Oh, I'm thinking of, like,
Yeah.
I'm going to be careful, like all those random things. I'm going to check behind the drawers in my dresser just to make sure I
Exactly.
don't know what the kids will find one day.
Please do. I've never found anything, quote, of value, but of great interest. This is probably the top of the heap.
Wow. Well, thanks
Very
for sharing it
interesting.
with us today.
No, thanks
We
for letting me come
appreciate it.
back. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jeff.
Right.